Hi, everybody. It's Jay, and I am back in the booth with you for another sneak peek video preview for this week's new release here on Say with Jay. Our new release this week is Episode 5 of Jessie Gussman's Second Chance with You. It's Book 4 in her Baxter Boys Sweet Romance series, and I've got more about the story and a preview of Episode 5 for you in just a bit. But first, I wanted to give you guys an update on something that I haven't mentioned lately, and that's my New Year's resolution to read the Bible cover to cover over 365 days. I've found a reading plan on the Bible app that I use, and away I went, and I'm doing pretty well. I'm actually a few days ahead. And I wanted to share some thoughts about some of the things that I wasn't really expecting, some things I wasn't really aware of that I'd never caught before. For instance, the sheer size of the Old Testament. I mean, I knew, obviously, that it wasn't a 50-50 split between Old and New, but I guess I thought it was probably more 60-40, when in reality, it's almost exactly 75%, 25%. And so I was a little surprised to realize that here it is in early September, and I'm still in the Old Testament with still several more days to go. But another thing is the theme and feeling of some of the books as a whole. You know, growing up, of course, I was familiar with stories and verses from the Old Testament, but Old Testament books themselves, some of them, weren't studied nearly to the degree that we studied New Testament books, for example. For instance, Lamentations. Okay, I knew Lamentations was not going to be a feel-good book. I mean, it's literally in the name. It is a collection of laments that Jeremiah wrote for the refugees of a fallen Jerusalem who are in captivity in Babylon. But, when I finished Lamentations, moving into Ezekiel and thinking, whew, okay, something a little bit lighter, something to brighten your day a little bit more, not so much. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not questioning the importance of Ezekiel, or any books in the Bible for that matter. But, a day brightener, something lighter, it's not so much, especially the early parts where it's essentially prophecies on the destruction of Jerusalem and the state of Israel, and then it moves into prophecies of the destruction of other nations. So, yeah, that was a bit of a surprise. But now, I've started the book of Daniel, and Daniel is a book that I think lots of us are fairly familiar with because of the stories that are in the book of Daniel. Like, for instance, Daniel being thrown into the lion's den, or, his three friends, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, being thrown into the furnace. And by the way, what is it with the Babylonians, man? They loved throwing people into things. Anyway, I digress. If you're not familiar, at the start of the book of Daniel, Daniel and his friends are young men who are captured at the fall of Jerusalem and are taken to Babylon to be educated and raised to serve in King Nebuchadnezzar's court. And that's what happens. Well, early on, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, a nightmare, and he calls all of his wise men, his soothsayers, his magicians, his astrologers, and you get the sense that he's probably gotten some bad advice or bad interpretations from them before, because he tells them, okay, guys, time for you to step up and earn your paycheck. Anybody can come up with an interpretation if I tell you my dream. I want you guys to tell me what I dreamed and then interpret it for me. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't go exactly well. And these wise men tell him, like, look, Your Highness, that's impossible. No man can know what you thought. And King Nebuchadnezzar, being not exactly the picture of kindness and understanding, orders all of his advisors, these wise men, these magicians, these astrologers, all of his advisors, to be put to death. And that includes Daniel and his friends. Well, at that point, Daniel makes the very brave and bold request to come before the king, and he tells him, these guys were right. No man can tell you what you thought. But my God, the one true living God, is powerful enough to work through me and tell you what you dreamed and what it means. And that's what happens. And, that secures Daniel and his friends places in the king's court. The point I'm getting to, though, is I don't think I'd ever really considered before the amount of sheer faith that Daniel had. I mean, there's faith with a lowercase f, and then there is a capital F, faith. And that is what Daniel had. Because, today, when we talk about having faith, or, we're asked to have faith, we typically have something in front of us that says, okay, here's what you should believe. Have faith in that. It happened in the New Testament all the time. Jesus, was constantly telling people, I'm the way, have faith in me. And my point being that people typically have a guide to go by, something to give them guidance of where their faith should be directed. Not Daniel. When Daniel made his request to the king, he had no idea what his dream was. He certainly had no idea what it meant. And he didn't even know if God wanted him to do that. God had not come to him before, like, say, Moses, and tell him to go do this thing. All he knew was his God was powerful enough to do this, and if it was his will, he would. Now, I don't know about y'all, if I made a claim like that without having the plan in place first, I'd probably be panicking. But not Daniel. He went to his friends, asked his friends to pray to God for him. He went and prayed to God. God heard his prayers, heard their prayers, and answered them and gave him the knowledge, the wisdom that he needed. Man, can you imagine if my goal, my wish, for not just me, but for everyone, but if I could have just a fraction of that level of faith that Daniel had, think about how that could change our lives. Anyway, just something to think about. And thanks for letting me update you on my journey through the Bible. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Second Chance with You and Episode 5. For those who don't know, Second Chance with You is the story of Ben Baxter. He is the shop supervisor and head mechanic for the Coleman Trucking Company, and he works in their terminal in Maine, and for the last 14 years has been raising his twin sisters after the death of their mother. And now he's ready to move on. But the company has asked him to transfer to the company's home terminal in Brickley Springs, Pennsylvania, which also happens to be Ben's hometown. And Ben's estranged family believes that he's married. and he's not going back without a wife. ... It's also the story of Riley Coleman, the daughter of the owner of the Coleman Trucking Company, and her father orders her to move to the home terminal, the underperforming home terminal, in Brickley Springs and turn it around, or else. Riley knows that in order for her to have any chance of this working, she needs to convince her shop supervisor and chief mechanic to move with her to Brickley Springs. But in addition to some difficult romantic history between the two, Ben has a rather unique request. That's all I'll say about that. But for now, here is a sample, and actually a rather spoiler-free sample of episode 5. I hope you enjoy it, and then you'll come back this Friday for the full episode here on Say with Jay. Monday morning, Ben woke without an alarm. Funny how the older he got, the less he seemed to be able to sleep. Or maybe he just had more interesting things to think about. Whatever it was, he got up and showered. It had been a long afternoon with Graham yesterday. She was used to being active and didn't make a very good patient. It wasn't that she wasn't allowed to move. She just wasn't allowed to move as much as she was used to. That, and she couldn't eat steak. Or bacon. Still, Riley and the twins had come, and they'd spent most of the day on lawn chairs in the backyard until Turbo and Harris had come in the evening to relieve them. While sitting there in the long afternoon, he'd had an idea about something he could do in the yard here at the farmhouse. He kind of wanted to surprise Riley with it, but since it wasn't his house, he'd probably better get permission first. Then the saying, "It's easier to get forgiveness than permission," ran through his head, and he figured, what could it hurt? Riley had mentioned a business trip next week. He'd think about doing it then. When he looked out the door, the eastern sky was just starting to glow, and Riley was at the rail, waiting on him. He hadn't been sure she'd be there. After all, he was the one who had quit with their little early morning meeting Saturday morning when he'd been angry. Although she's the one that said she was quitting. It was nice she forgave him so easily. Her head turned when he opened the door and stepped out still in his bare feet. Her eyes crinkled, and her smile hit him straight in the gut. Maybe he was foolish to come out and expose his heart. "Good morning, Ben," she said softly. "Morning." He walked slowly to her. Their eyes held as he walked to the rail beside her. He didn't put his arm around her like he'd longed to do all night. Would she lean into him like she did at the hospital? Or like she had in Graham's hall? He was willing to take the chance, but he didn't want to push Riley. He breathed in the scent he would forever associate with sweet happiness. They didn't talk a lot. The sunrise touched their faces, turning them pink, then orange, along with the wide expanse of sky over the low mountain bench in the distance. Somehow this morning he was aware of every breath she took, every time the slight breeze took her hair and shifted it. He wanted to touch her skin, feel her heart against his, but he reminded himself it wasn't his right. He had his eyes on the sky, trying to focus on the beauty before him, his forearms resting on the banister, his hands clasped, when her fingertips touched his arm. He almost jumped out of his skin from the charge. His eyes snapped to hers, but she was looking at the flaming sky, as though in awe. Her light touch scrambled his brain and made the sunrise pale in comparison to the feeling that stirred in his soul. Pretty sure that wasn't part of the fake marriage bargain. Whatever was going on between them, he hoped he'd be able to stand it when it ended. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.